Welcome to TaiwanTalks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Eric Huang. In May, news of NATO considering a liaison office in Japan, aiming to foster coordination with partners in the Indo-Pacific region, notably Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand, was being discussed. However, in Vilnius, the joint communique released omitted any mention of the proposed liaison office. As China and Taiwan looms large behind Ukraine, will NATO's intention to establish a liaison office in Tokyo be on hold? Joining us today are Chen-shen, National Chengchi University Political Science Professor, Vincent Chao, DPP Taipei City Councilor, and Yeh-chung, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor and the Chair. A very warm welcome to all on the show. The first question goes to Professor Lu. Is there any possibility, in your perspective, of NATO's expanding its influence in East Asia? If it's so, what are the reasons behind this decision?
Yes, we can see that NATO right now has 31 members, especially after Finland's admission in 2022. And Sweden will join NATO as the 32nd member to that regional organization. NATO, of course, is considering expanding its influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Main reason can be seen as a reaction to China's rising assertiveness. I'm not suggesting that China is the evil empire now, but what China is doing is actually very watchful and also remindful to all NATO members. But in the meantime, let's keep this in mind. NATO is a security and political regional intergovernmental organization, so it will be also very sensitive to the potential political and security consequences if the decision is to be made. Mm-hmm. As stated, NATO's purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. Mm-hmm. But in the past few months, as we can see, NATO began to start its cooperation with countries in this region. For example, with Australia, NATO already signed the Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. And right now, the program itself is going to be expanded to include New Zealand, Japan, and Korea. What those programs are covering mainly are related to climate change, cybersecurity, etc. So as we can see, NATO is very cautious on expanding its influence in this region.
Right, but there's still a little bit of evidence of expanding its influence in different regions. For Vincent, so asserting that NATO's liaison office in Tokyo is comparable to an Asia iteration of NATO would likely be an overstatement. So nonetheless, could you elaborate on why Japan was chosen as the location for a new liaison office?
I'm not 100% convinced that having a liaison office in Tokyo would be an Asian version of NATO. I do think it would be more of a NATO plus one in the sense of NATO bringing Japanese security concerns, security interests into the larger fold that is NATO. I do think that there are a number of factors at play as we think about potential Japanese participation through liaison office or through other manners within NATO. The first one is that we can't forget that Japan, in a sense, also has Atlantic implications. And we know it's very far, but it's also very close to Russia. And so this Atlantic implication has been there. If we assume that Russia is more of an Atlantic power than it is a Pacific power, this implication has been there since the early 20th century. I mean, we've seen a series of conflicts even prior to the First World War where Japan and Russia had played a part. So bringing Japan in, I think, does have consequences for ensuring security, by and large, if we're talking about Russia and China in particular. But I think more of, second of all, I mean, Japan's a U.S. ally and has been for a very long time. And I think Japan does have a strong security partnership with many of these countries in NATO. I mean, we saw the participation from the Japanese PM within NATO, and we know that this cooperation has been long-standing. I mean, it's his second meeting in NATO. He attended for the first time ever last year, but certainly these sort of exchanges are going to become more and more routine. I think the third point, and the main point I'd like to make, is that there is a strong interest by Japan. I mean, it has to come from Japan. Any NATO participation originates from the member country itself. And so there's a strong interest from Japan to see if NATO, to bring a bit of NATO over to Asia. So you're right in a sense that they want NATO to pay increasing attention to what's happening here in NATO. And I think vice versa. I think NATO by itself also has a strong interest in what's happening here in East Asia vis-a-vis China and hopes to use Japan in a method that can bring them more information and more sharing in this respect. So I'll just draw close by saying this. We're seeing NATO integrate this new program called the Individually Tailored Partnership Program, the ITPP, and that's focused on countries like, for example, Japan. And so it's not exactly the same as having a liaison office, but it does enhance information sharing, training, capacity building, and so forth. So I do think it's a lead up to a potential future liaison office by NATO in Japan.
Okay, that's great. I mean, following Vincent's statement, I'm curious about Professor Yen's perspective on this. So what aspects of Asian security is NATO interested in exactly?
Well, NATO, I think, is just like a previous G7 meeting. They just think that this regional security is also global security. I think they specifically mentioned about this one. So yes, they care about a region that is stable. I think it's also for the NATO country, they worry about China's we call systemic challenge. Okay, they didn't talk about a specific like South China Sea or Taiwan, but they talk about China being a different player in the international system that sometimes doesn't follow, okay, we call the international norms or rules. So this is where they feel that if China is not contained or being brought to be basically in alliance with the global framework security, and then there would be a some kind of potential trouble. So I think that's the reason they focus on China's being a challenge. But at the same time, I think Professor Liu and Vincent also mentioned that the so-called Tokyo liaison office is not in the pipe right now because it was not mentioned in the communique. But during the press conference, when the Japanese reporter asked about this, I think they basically Stoltenberg just answered that it's not something that is going to happen right now. So I think it's some kind of gesture showing that the NATO is interested in the security of Asia. But don't forget one thing. If Japan, Korea, or Australia, New Zealand becoming really a Asian type of NATO, then there would be consequences and implication. It's like will China feel so besieged that it would do something preemptive first?
Yeah.
So I think NATO has to take that into consideration.
Right. Let's put your statement in a more institutionalized context. So like Asia currently has several existing military alliances, right? And partners with the West, such as like US-UK alliance, US-Japan alliance, US-Philippines alliance, Quad, AUKUS. So in your opinion, is there any possibility in the future that these current alliances will progressively amalgamate into a comprehensive multilateral alliance, potentially culminating in the establishment of this so-called Asian analog to NATO?
Well, I think if you look at the U.S., UK, or Australia, Japan, I think these are pretty reliable if they want to grow from this basis. But South Korea right now is very close to Japan and United States, very close to the U.S. But you never know. After another presidential election, if a left-wing government came up, we don't know where it's going. New Zealand is also a X factor. Sometimes it's not as reliable. And then sometimes we talk about Indo-Pacific. India, I don't think India will be specifically being brought into one camp. India pride about its long tradition of being the long-alliance country, being a neutral country among the major powers, not just U.S. And Soviet Union before, not just U.S. and China before, but also right now, keeping a distance between U.S., China, and Russia. So it would be very difficult. But the core, of Great Britain, U.S., Australia, and New Zealand, I think those are probably will happen.
I certainly can understand that the idea of the Asian NATO is still distant from the point of time we're talking. But I still wonder, why are the NATO countries willing to share some of their civilians' efforts in monitoring China, right? If they don't really want to, pose as a threat to China, they probably will kind of, take that back. So maybe Professor Lu, we can answer this.
It is a very interesting question, because every time when we are talking about the expansion of NATO, it always comes with the question like whether NATO is going to expand, when and how NATO is going to expand. But in this case, as we can see, NATO seems to be walking on a very thin line here. It's trying to improve its relationship, especially security and political relationship with the allies in the Indo-Pacific. But in the meantime, for this purpose, they tried very hard, NATO members, they tried very, very hard, and trying to understand why China is conducting so many different advanced research on missile developments, something like that. For example, ultrasound missile system. And also they are worried about possible or potential Chinese further cooperation on military terms with Russia. That would become a serious threat to Europe. But in the meantime, they also pay a close attention to the rising tensions between China and the United States. And they don't want to get involved totally, but they also want to be prepared. I think that's why they are sharing information on monitoring China.
So Vincent, do you have anything to say about this?
Well, I'll say it like this. I mean, NATO is not an anti-Russia alliance. I mean, NATO is really focused on protecting the security of all of its member countries. And, primarily that has traditionally focused on the Atlantic sphere. And so it's focused on the protection of Europe. But I think as we see what's going on now vis-a-vis China, as we do think the growing threat of authoritarianism worldwide, not just in Russia, they have very much come to this idea, and I think come to a conclusion that they really must preemptively look to defend themselves against rising authoritarianism here in East Asia as well. So to put it bluntly, you can't just think about threats in isolation of geography. Like it has to become a more holistic perspective in terms of what the threats are and where they're going to be and how they're going to manifest. And so to that sense, I think NATO has come to a sort of conclusion, I wouldn't say consensus, but at least a preliminary conclusion that China must be monitored and that China could one day pose a very much the same threat it does here in East Asia to NATO countries.
Right, that's great. I mean, even if with that minimal presence of NATO in Asia, China has a strong response. So, Professor Yen, so China has responded to NATO's attempts to exert its influence in East Asia by urging the alliance to stop provoking confrontation by drawing ideological lines. So, what's Beijing's objective here?
Well, I'm a little shocked about the very strong reaction from China because. If you look at the communique, there is no mentioning of Taiwan. There is no criticism of China in Hong Kong or in Tibet or in Xinjiang.
Right.
Those are the core issues China always mention. But this is talking about China being a systemic challenge, and especially in terms of in the future about the cyber warfare. And I don't think this is, suddenly China has this kind of being very sensitive to those issues, but you are a different system. So when your opponents disagree with you on your system, on your ideology, I think that's pretty natural. I don't know why, Zhang Jun from the UN and then Hua Chunying, the spokesperson, react so strongly. But they do, point out the problem of NATO is that NATO did have a lot of involvement that is probably beyond its mission, like in Libya, right, before. And then also, if you look at the Afghanistan, which is a justified war because of the attack. And so most of the NATO country went in. But then you also have the Iraqi war, which a lot of NATO countries said, no, this is not U.S. being attacked, so they were not in there. But even in Afghanistan and Iraq, you do have problem of treating the prisoner of war. You have, killing of the civilian. So there are something can be criticized. But at the same time, China is saying, hey, you are in Europe, or you can say Europe Atlantic. But why are you interested in Asia?
Yeah.
That's
It's
beyond,
kind of distant
yeah,
from,
that's beyond your regionalism, right? But the question, I think China doesn't have to worry, because I think NATO does care about security, stability in East Asia. But if these four countries, especially Japan and Korea, being brought into this, being a member of NATO, which also means if there is a conflict between China and Japan or Korea, that the whole NATO will be involved. I don't think NATO will want that. Okay, but this is their reaction to, I think, to the nudging of the United States. Just saying, we care about Asia.
Sure. Really quick, Professor Lu, would you kind of add up to, we're thinking about the perspective of President Xi. I think that he has been like in this standoff with the United States for at least 3 years, right? So would you say that he viewed the perpetuation of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and China as a preferable scenario, or you think that he would like to kind of back down a little bit and soften his attitudes?
I think that depends, because right now what concerns Xi the most is his position within the party and also in China. So I would say the consolidation of its political power of CCP, and also the consolidation of personal political power of Xi Jinping, that would be to him the paramount task for as a leader in China. But in the meantime, as we can see, Xi is trying to be very sensitive to the changing course of the U.S.-China competition, and also trying to be responsive to the local people's need, for example, nationalism. So I think this will be a combination. So it depends. In the following months, maybe we would see that Xi Jinping will back down for a bit, because right now he also think his attendance to APEC would be a great addition to his political power within the party. So maybe in the following few months we can see this kind of changing attitude in China.
Okay, for Vincent, now we kind of changed somewhat a different topic, is that we talk about China more now. So despite China being a non-democratic country, does it endeavor to uphold with some NATO member countries that adhere to democratic principles? I mean, China still needs friends from the democratic camp.
I think traditionally China's approach, whether it has come to NATO or it has come to the EU, has been really this idea of divide and conquer. And so they're going to pick off whoever country that they feel more conducive or responsive to their interests, and use that to drive a wedge in terms of consensus building within NATO and within the EU. I mean, we've seen that successful to a certain degree here in ASEAN. I mean, you can't forget that just a few years ago, I mean, Laos and Cambodia, there was this big controversy when they did not agree to the statement condemning China's action in the South China Sea, even though they're not exactly claimants to the South China Sea. But these countries are therefore seen as having a closer relationship with China and impeding ASEAN's progress as a whole in terms of coming to a consensus on that. So, I do think China is certainly, I mean, they're led by smart people, we can assume. And so they're going to do everything they can, which is to further fragment unity, whether it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Russia, but also especially China. And so we can expect more of that as time goes on.
Okay, the next question goes to Professor Yan. So according to your observation, so what steps could China take, or has already taken, to counter the formation of the Asian NATO in this scenario?
Well, I think right now is basically you have a very strong, vocal president in China talking about the rise of China, about the renaissance of China. And then also we have seen a lot of people, we call it, the wolf from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. So this is totally different. If we look at China under Hu Jintao, if China developed the same thing, but with a different people there, different rhetoric, would the US or the European country, NATO, care about this as much? I think China probably need to tone down some of the things because this rising nationalism, I think, has been whipped up by the leadership sometimes. So if your leaders show some kind of restraint, then it will help. So if China doesn't do that, and then of course you will have the U.S. strategy of containment, of trying to get more allies joining this regional kind of military alliance. So we don't know which one. Sometimes you would think which one caused the problem, which one is chicken, which one is egg. I think both. Both the United States and China are responsible for the rising tension. And European countries have been unwillingly to be brought into this case. So yes, China would probably try to divide and conquer. But if Asian country right now, especially Korea's attitude is changing without a return to the previous left-wing government in the future, in the next 10 years, then I think China needs to reconsider its strategy, because that is a strong alliances led by the U.S. In the traditional kind of containment strategy type in the East Asia and dealing with China.
Okay, next one, we still talk about President Xi for Professor Lu. Taking Russia, now the Ukrainian war is still going on. Probably it's hard for us to see the end of it by the end of this year. So Russia, China, NATO, they are all bonded together. So taking Russia as a distinct factor into account, so does President Xi still require President Putin's support despite Xi's personal aspiration to assume leadership over authoritarian regime worldwide?
Yes, I think at least for now, to Xi Jinping, if Putin fails, then he definitely would be the next target of the world. So to Xi Jinping, I would say the best bet he would put is Putin will be there, Russia will be there, but would be not strong enough to challenge the West as well as China. But he wants to escape the trap in which Putin is too weak, Russia is just too weak, and that would require China's assistance to sustain Russia. So I think he is in a way of dilemma here. But in the meantime, if we look into how CCP consolidates its political power in China, CCP's legitimacy actually comes from three different elements. One is the ideology of communism. Second one usually being economic development. And the third one would usually be nationalism. So why I would say Xi needs to be very, very careful in reading the air among the Western countries. That is because right now Xi Jinping is trying to restore the power of ideology, but maybe it won't be so successful as he expected. And also for economic development, we see that in the post-COVID era, China's economy wasn't so good. And also for nationalism, there will be a limitation, because if you have a nationalism too strong, then that can somehow challenge the rule of CCP.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So it goes to Vincent, considering Putin's setback over NATO's support in the war in Ukraine. So do you think that Xi is learning from this experience, particularly with the NATO's growing influence in Asia?
Well, first say I was at this think tank event in Europe a few months ago, and somebody said that the only end result of Russia's war in Ukraine is that Russia is going to be China's gas station for years to come. I mean, Russia is not going to be able to play any other geopolitical role other than being sort of China's subsidiary or China's sidekick in their global ambitions. But certainly, I do think, I agree with Professor Liu in the sense that China is going to do everything they can to prop up Putin, because Putin losing, there's nothing in it that's good for China. However, at the same time, I do think China is looking closely into the lessons learned this time around here in Ukraine. Just like Taiwan isn't Ukraine, I mean, China isn't exactly Russia. I mean, China has multitudes of more foreign reserves. Right. Their economy is going to be more resilient. Countries, in a sense, are more dependent on China than they are Russia. And China has global international sway. And so they have a lot of things going for them. But certainly, they're going to look at the lessons learned this time around and hopefully bring that back for them, hopefully for them, and in a sense, make adjustments in their approach, not only towards Taiwan, but their terms of engagement with the West.
Okay, Professor Yan, can we reasonably assert that Taiwan is the main driving force behind NATO's expansion of influence in Asia? Could you say that?
I would not say Taiwan is, because if Taiwan is important, I think the communique will at least, putting Taiwan in wording, right? It's not there. But and also the whole conference, if you look at the whole summit, we only have one mentioning of Taiwan by Stoltenberg. It was in a press conference responding, when NATO country met with Swedish delegation. And so it was during that press conference that Stoltenberg mentioned Taiwan. So I'm not sure that, in Taiwan, sometimes we feel that, there is a mentioning of Taiwan, we blow it up, but the whole process is still, I would use the word to criticize NATO, opaque, because we don't know. Maybe during the discussion.
There's Taiwan.
Taiwan being discussed. But if you really care about Taiwan, why don't you put in words? So, but it's not in the communique. So I'm not sure this is. If you look at the whole communique, I would say NATO still care about first Ukraine war, and then about Russia, of course China, but also the neighboring issues within Europe, including, they look at Belarus, they talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, they talk about Georgia, they talk about Moldova, they talk about Serbia, and even talk about Kosovo, what happened in northern Kosovo. And then, of course, the North Africa being a place of exporting some of the refugees, so they care. So it is still more regional. I think that's, we have to be pragmatic enough to know this is NATO, this is Euro-Atlantic, and the focus will always be in Europe.
Vincent probably have something to say about this. Why don't they put Taiwan in words in the communique?
Well, I absolutely agree. I don't think Taiwan is the main driving force. I think China is, to a certain extent, the main driving force. And China's actions, whether in terms of the East China Sea, the South China Sea, whether in terms of against Korea and Japan, I think that has caused a lot of concern. And I think Professor Yuan is absolutely right. NATO's focus will always be on the protection of NATO member states. I mean, that's the primary mission. But when the risk and challenges from China ebb over, potentially impacting NATO member states, that's when they're going to get involved. So I do think that having a potential liaison office in Japan, maybe not now, but sometime in the future, having greater coordination here in Indo-Pacific, I think plays very much into NATO's own interests. I mean, it's very much for the protection of NATO itself.
Okay, so if Taiwan is not a sole reason, or this is not a salient reason for NATO to deal with China, so to speak. So what are other factors you think NATO is in trying to exert its influence in Asia?
I think the main driving force, adding to what we have discussed, China, I would say the U.S.-China increasing tensions, that would be the main driving force behind their thinking. Because as we can see, NATO has to be a very significant player in geopolitics. When it comes to this kind of issues, political security issues, NATO try to prove that it is very capable of dealing with those issues. But in the meantime, as we can see in the Indo-Pacific region, for the economic side, the United States has proposed the IPEF in the past, and also the United States is leading the Quad and also the AUKUS. But for NATO countries, NATO members, they are also trying to say that because this region is highly related to globalization, to the flow of goods and trades. So they are also trying to pay some attention to that.
Well, we already kind of learned from your discussion that NATO is not so explicit about aggressive against China or anything. Do you guys agree with the notion that France plays a part in that? Any of you?
Well, of course, France does play a part on this, but I think NATO also do care about the security threat from China, because even though it is not being mentioned in the communique, but in his press conference responding to a South Korean journalist or correspondent, Li Yue, she asked about North Korea and China, but Stoltenberg mentioned that China by 2035 will have 15,000 nuclear warhead. That also the range is reaching all the way to Europe. So he mentioned about that, but it's not in the communique. So, which means they obviously have discussed this. So, as someone who represents the NATO to respond to the question of the journalist in the press conference, if this is something that being discussed, of course. He mentioned. So I think they right now maybe they don't think China is going to be a security threat immediately to Europe. It's Russia. It's in Ukraine. But in the future it might be.
Yeah. Really quick, 1 minute. Vincent, what about France?
Well, I think France. I mean, I don't think it's France by themselves. I think France is saying something that many actually countries in Europe actually do believe, which is that NATO should always have this Eurocentric focus. And if NATO were to bring much more of its focus to Asia, then that's going to dilute its centrality on Europe. So I do think that France is representing what a number of NATO countries think, and I think they're just saying that quite part out loud. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Regarding the issue of NATO, we interviewed Eric Huang, Harvard Kennedy School Manson Program Fellow. He's also Kuomintang International Affairs Department Deputy Director. Let's take a look.
Eric, NATO being an Atlantic organization seems to now also be focusing on the Indo-Pacific. With its new strategy and in its meeting in Lithuania, China was mentioned many times alongside peace in the Taiwan Strait. What is NATO trying to achieve here? Are NATO members trying to set a line with China?
Yes, if you look at the nature and the purpose of NATO is essentially a collective security group. So, countries put themselves together, one for all for one, for defense purposes, to collectively defend itself against any potential threats. In the past, that threat might have been Soviet Union or Russia. And now people see that China continuously to challenge the global existing order and refusal to condone Russia's behavior being threatening and at least being concerning. So it makes perfect sense for NATO nations to address this issue early, and hopefully the Chinese will change its behavior accordingly.
With the leaders of Japan and South Korea attending the summit, are the dynamics shifting to Asia, and how will this impact the entire strategic movement of NATO?
I think the Japanese and the Korean are two very valuable democratic allies in Indo-Pacific region. With their participation, the NATO collectively will pay more attention to the security threat. In this case, the Chinese military aggressions, and as the NATO secretary, as the NATO secretary put it, using its economics as coercive tools. So the NATO will now pay more attention to the region. However, I think in the foreseeable future, they will still focus most of their attention in the Ukraine situation.
What does this mean for the Taiwan Strait? Do you feel this could translate to more deterrence for Taiwan in preventing a Chinese invasion?
When we talk about deterrence, there are several pillars. One pillar, obviously, is Taiwan's military capability. Two others, which in my opinion interact with one another. One being Taiwanese determination to fight. Third being how fast or how soon and the level of determination of the international world or international community being willing and able to come together in a coalition to support Taiwan. I think these NATO efforts helps in that regard, address these issues that much needs to be discussed. And the international community already have a lot of background and will come to understanding even before such action happens. And I think this will help bolster Taiwanese determination, and overall this will serve as a deterrence for the Chinese in the future to come.
We've also seen an interesting development in Germany. The country released its Indo-Pacific strategy and mentioned the importance of peace and stability in the strait, and also increased its military activity in the region. Is Germany setting an example for other NATO members in Europe?
I think Germany's action speaks really loud than just words. I think Germany is doing the right thing, and I think Germany, in particular, in my perspective, did it with kid's glove. They did it really carefully. I think they try not to provoke the Chinese. That's why I think they focus on maintaining peace and stability rather than really just pointing fingers at any particular action. But however, I think this is the Germany is taking a huge step towards giving Taiwan the support it needs for the international community, and I suspect that many will follow.
Do you feel this marks a stark difference with France, as its president, Emmanuel Macron, on his way back from China, released his strategic autonomy stance?
As people understand Western European politics, France and Germany, there are two major countries in that power dynamic. I think we do see some contrast there. However, I think France hopefully will follow Germany's footstep and come to a democratic side and come to more of assistance to Taiwan.
The NATO summit this year was held in Lithuania. As a former Soviet state, how does this differ from other NATO summits?
Well, I think the significance, especially for Taiwan, is that Lithuania had to fight Soviet aggression. And at one point in time, before World War II, there was a peace treaty between the two countries. And in World War II, Soviet occupied Lithuania, and Lithuania, with the help of the United States, finally had its independence in the 1980s. I think this helped Taiwan see as a role model, especially in the recent years. Lithuania and Taiwan enjoys a great diplomatic relations. Lithuania is now open its representative office in Taiwan. So I think we're not surprised that, when NATO meetings is hosted in Lithuania and Taiwan became a hot topic.
Vincent, Eric Huang and you are equally good at translating presidential speeches. Okay, so does his kind of comments sound familiar as a DPP legislator? I mean, politicians over there?
Well, I say Eric's a good friend of mine, and I want to congratulate him on being accepted to Harvard, where he now acts as a fellow there. I do think that when it comes to foreign affairs, you're going to see a lot of consensus, whether in terms of our diplomatic relations, whether in terms of defense. And I think many of the points that Eric made are salient. I mean, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true that, in a sense, NATO is concerned about China. I mean, there are elements of NATO that have varying positions on China, but on the whole, I think there is growing concern on China. And concern extends not only to China itself, but what China represents in terms of the encroaching authoritarianism that we see in many places around the world. And so, Eric's in Washington, D.C. He's going to have a different perspective than us here in Taipei. But certainly, I do think that he represents the consensus view of many of the scholars and experts I talk to often from Washington, D.C. and how they see NATO's role here in East Asia. But I will say this, which is, as we think about NATO's role here in East Asia, we do always have to be mindful that in the end, any leadership position within NATO is not going to be played by Japan, by South Korea, by Australia, by New Zealand. I think it's very much still going to be a U.S.-led effort. I do think that as we look at NATO's expansionism here, although the U.S. has not come out in support of it, we do recognize that in terms of the U.S. alliance system that has been built over the Second World War, that's going to play an integral part of it. And so the U.S. is very much going to continue to play the leading role in terms of ensuring security here in the Indo-Pacific region.
Do you agree with his comment that the U.S. is going to be behind the scene of the whole NATO?
Just like I earlier mentioned, most of the things maybe, even the so-called East Asian NATO, that would be part of the U.S. nudging the, Brussels to do it. And when I teach the course in international relations, we always joke about NATO being an acronym of no action, talks only, right? So here, I think NATO met a lot and talked a lot, but I'm not sure, and then they can always hide behind some kind of like European, like say, oh, we want to build consensus. Ukraine's application has been delayed for 15 years.
Right.
At least, well, probably if you count it started from 1998, that's 25 years. And that's even before the invasion.
Right.
And then other countries, so they keep delaying a lot of things. So I'm not sure, the East Asian NATO will work. I think this is just European country within the NATO, just saying, oh, US, if you want to lead, you want us to respond, we would pass some kind of statement about this, that's it.
If the East Asian NATO is not of utility, Professor Lu, so the concept of military-oriented Asian version NATO kind of impossible for now. What about economy NATO? In fact, that the UK Prime Minister Liz Truss, during her speech in Taiwan, she visited Taiwan a while ago. She, offered this idea. So what's the comment on this possibility?
Yes, actually, in Liz Truss' speech, she mentioned that free nations must commit themselves to a free Taiwan and must be prepared to back it up with concrete measures. But we look into her statement and also making some analogy from history, we can easily find that during the Cold War, actually the leading Western countries, 17 of them actually organized COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And also, dating back maybe more than 10 years ago, the United Kingdom also mentioned that the United Kingdom is trying to propose allying with other Western countries to ban some submarine technologies that can be transferred to Russia. But what we have now, I think this kind of statement can help to raise people's awareness about China's this kind of coercive economic behavior. But if we try to make it concrete, maybe it will take more time than we expected.
Vincent, so how would the economic NATO look like in the future, if possible?
Well, I think this is this is a very important topic, because when we talk about security, it's not just physical security, right? It very much does involve economic security. And so the coercive actions that the PRC is engaged in impact countries not only militarily. I mean, they're also very economic in nature. I mean, look at what's happened in Australia in terms of their sanctions on Australian wine, on Australian minerals, and certain Australian resources, what they've conducted here in Taipei by banning hundreds, if not thousands, of agricultural products. And that's all very much to affect a political purpose. And so when you have countries here in East Asia that are dependent enormously economically on China, you're never going to achieve true economic security. And so from that perspective, yes, it's absolutely salient to talk about economic NATO. The question, of course, is how you're going to put it together, because the problem is there's no leadership role right now. I mean, if you look at TPP, that was the economic NATO.
Right, yeah,
and
sort of, right?
Well, I mean, it was. I mean, it was formulated to counter economic coercion from China. It was to counter Chinese economic practices, to hopefully bring Chinese economic and trade standards up to an international standard. But the U.S. withdrew from that, and Japan has stepped in. Now, that has not replaced the American role, completely. And so to a certain extent, I think there does have to be this discussion. I do think that leadership role is required, but missing. And so hopefully we'll be able to see the United States or other countries step into that leadership vacuum in the future.
That's very intriguing, Professor Yen. Do you agree the existence of the economic NATO is going to be helpful to Taiwan without the presence of China?
Well, I think it would be very difficult. It's a little bit like, when China is the biggest, trading partner for most of the country in East Asia, including, Japan, Korea, and then you go down to the ASEAN country. So it will be, China is using its market, its investment, its Belt and Road Initiative, basically to as incentive to further its relation with those countries, just a little bit like U.S. in the past, right? U.S. just use its market because every country want to export to U.S. market, including Taiwan, including China. That U.S. using that purchasing capability as a economic instrument that turned to become political instrument, but it failed in this aspect to change China. It helped, transform Korea and Taiwan, but didn't get the the result they want. So China still using its, just like the U.S. before, is using the size of its economy, investment, and then also this kind of assistance in infrastructure building to be considered always a indispensable player.
Okay.
And so recently, while we talk about Japan, Korea, having, maybe in this NATO, or even we talk about relation, but look at this China, Japan, Korea try to, resurrect the trilateral meeting they used to have before, right?
Let's shift the gear a bit, and the question goes to Professor Lu. In the past 2 years, some experts and academics have put forth predictions such as 2027 may mark a crucial juncture regarding the Taiwan's contingency. So if the prediction proves accurate, that would be very unfortunate. What's the function of NATO at that time, in your estimation?
In my speculation, I would say NATO from now on would continue to say China's certain behavior would be considered as too aggressive, and trying to persuade China to shape China's behavior. But to what extent this would be effective, I'm not so sure. For the year 2027, that will be only 4 years from now. I think what we can do is we can try to understand China's security concern, and also for the international community, we can also share our security concern to have a sincere dialogue with China. I know I'm not saying this kind of dialogue will lead to a rosy picture for the Taiwan Strait, but at least I think this is a way worth trying.
2027, Vincent?
Well, again, I do think 2027 has always been about capabilities and China potentially having those capabilities to affect a vision for Taiwan that is very much in their favor. But I will say this, 2027 is never carved in stone. If we assume that and accept that it's capability based, then the one thing we need to answer by is having a better capabilities and further be able to utilize our geographical advantages, working with partners and allies, and that includes NATO members. And that includes having discussions with NATO on ensuring joint security for all democracies around the world. And so I do think 2027, we have to be concerned, but we also have to use this as a wake-up call to put ourselves in motion and hope that 2027 never takes place.
In this episode, our guest speakers examine the potential establishment of an Asian NATO, whether it entails a military alliance or an economic partnership. We explored the current military alliances between the United States and countries like Korea, Japan, and even Philippines. Despite recent indication of improving relations between the United States and China, the future direction of this relationship remains uncertain. It's crucial to acknowledge that military preparation among democracies primarily aims to prevent conflict rather than provoke them. We hope you found today's show engaging. Feel free to leave us a comment on our YouTube channel, and remember to subscribe to the future updates. Until next time, take care.